In a quiet Detroit factory in the early 1910s, long before highways stitched America together, a polished carriage-shaped automobile rolled silently across a concrete floor. There was no crank handle, no coughing exhaust, no cloud of smoke hanging in the air. A woman in a long skirt stepped inside, turned a simple control, and the vehicle moved forward without vibration. It felt less like a machine and more like a refined household appliance. This was the Detroit electric car, produced by the Anderson Electric Car Company in Detroit during the 1910s. Decades before Tesla, decades before lithium-ion batteries, this early electric vehicle was already on American roads. It competed directly with gasoline cars from Henry Ford's rapidly expanding empire. And for a brief moment, it wasn't a novelty. It was a serious contender in the young automotive industry. Today, when people search for the first electric car or early electric vehicles before Tesla, they often discover that the electric revolution didn't begin in the 21st century. The mystery is why companies like Detroit Electric, which had a clear market edge in comfort and ease of use, ultimately faded while gasoline vehicles reshaped the world. By the 1910s, the automobile industry wasn't yet dominated by a single technology. Steam cars had power, but required careful handling. Gasoline cars were noisy, required hand cranking to start, and could be temperamental. Electric cars, by contrast, were clean and simple. You stepped in, adjusted the controller, and drove away. No gears to grind, no engine to flood. Detroit Electric positioned itself as a premium, practical solution. Its vehicles were particularly popular among urban drivers, including many women, who appreciated not having to wrestle with a crank starter. Contemporary advertisements emphasized reliability, elegance, and freedom from grease and grime. Some accounts suggest that notable figures, including Clara Ford, wife of Henry Ford, preferred electric vehicles for personal use, though historians debate the extent of that claim. What's certain is that electric cars had a respected place in the early market. The technology was straightforward for its time. Lead-acid batteries powered an electric motor connected directly to the wheels. Range estimates varied, but many Detroit electric models could travel 60 to 80 miles on a single charge under favorable conditions. For urban driving in 1910, that was often more than sufficient. Charging could be done at home overnight. In cities with relatively short commutes and limited road networks, electric cars made sense. And then, there was Henry Ford. In 1908, Ford introduced the Model T. By the 1910s, his assembly line innovations dramatically lowered production costs. Gasoline cars became cheaper each year. The Model T wasn't elegant, but it was durable and affordable. Price began to matter more than refinement. As Ford's competitors scrambled to match his scale, Detroit Electric faced a structural challenge. Electric vehicles were inherently more expensive due to battery costs and lower production volumes. Still, price alone doesn't fully explain what happened. In the early 20th century, America was changing rapidly. Cities were expanding, but so were rural communities connecting to broader markets. Roads improved, distances between destinations increased, gasoline infrastructure expanded alongside oil discoveries in places like Texas and Oklahoma. Fuel stations became more common. The gasoline car's limitations, noise, fumes, manual starting, began to feel less significant compared to its growing range and refueling speed. Electric vehicles, meanwhile, remained tethered to charging time. Overnight charging worked for predictable urban routines. It didn't suit spontaneous long-distance travel. As Americans grew more mobile and the culture of the road trip emerged, range became freedom. There's an irony here. In the 1910s, electric cars were often marketed as sophisticated and modern, while gasoline cars were seen as rough machines for mechanics and adventurers. But cultural perception shifted. Gasoline engines improved. The invention of the electric starter in 1912 eliminated the dangerous hand crank. With that change, the convenience gap narrowed almost overnight. Detroit Electric continued producing vehicles into the 1920s, but the market momentum had clearly shifted. Production numbers remained modest compared to Ford's millions of Model Ts. The company adapted where it could, offering upgraded battery options and emphasizing quality. Yet scale was against them. The story of Detroit Electric isn't one of sudden collapse. It's a story of gradual overshadowing. As gasoline vehicles became cheaper and more versatile, electric cars began to look constrained. What had once been their advantage, urban practicality, turned into a limitation in a country stretching outward. So the mystery deepens. If electric cars were already viable in the 1910s, if they were quieter, cleaner, and in many ways easier to operate, why did they lose ground so decisively? Was it purely economics? Was it infrastructure? Or was it something more subtle about how Americans defined progress and independence? Because in that early Detroit factory, when the electric motor hummed and the carriage rolled forward without smoke, it didn't look like a technology destined for extinction. It looked like the beginning of something enduring. And yet, within a few decades, the electric passenger car would all but disappear from American roads, leaving behind only photographs, advertisements, and a question that still lingers today. As the 1910s moved forward, Detroit Electric wasn't operating in a vacuum. The entire automotive landscape was evolving at a speed few industries had ever seen. In 1900, electric cars had reportedly accounted for a significant share of vehicles on American roads, especially in cities like New York and Boston. By the end of the 1910s, gasoline cars were rapidly taking over. The shift wasn't dramatic, it was incremental. Each year, gasoline vehicles improved slightly. Each year, production costs dropped. Each year, the supporting infrastructure expanded. Detroit Electric's business model relied heavily on urban predictability. Its cars were ideal for short daily travel, shopping, social visits, commuting within city limits. They were quiet, clean, and relatively easy to maintain. Owners could recharge at home, avoiding the need for fuel deliveries or public stations. In an era when electricity was becoming more common in affluent neighborhoods, this felt modern and self-contained. But electricity in the early 20th century wasn't universally accessible. Rural America lagged behind in electrification. Large portions of the country didn't receive reliable electric service until the 1930s under federal programs. Gasoline, by contrast, could be transported and stored more flexibly. As oil production expanded, fuel distribution networks grew quickly. A can of gasoline could be delivered to remote areas far more easily than electrical infrastructure could be installed. That asymmetry mattered. The United States wasn't just urbanizing, it was spreading outward. Farmers needed vehicles capable of traveling long distances on rough roads. Salesmen crossed county lines. Families began imagining cross-state travel. In that expanding geography, range became symbolic. A gasoline car could be refueled in minutes and continue for hundreds of miles. An electric car needed hours to recharge and had a more limited distance window. Even within cities, the psychology of ownership began to change. The automobile stopped being a carefully planned daily tool and became an expression of autonomy. Drivers wanted the ability to leave town on impulse, to explore beyond trolley lines and paved streets. The gasoline engine, with its expanding range and improving reliability, aligned with that aspiration. Detroit Electric's vehicles, meanwhile, remained positioned as refined and dependable. They were often more expensive than Ford's Model T, in some cases significantly more. The batteries themselves were costly and heavy. Lead-acid technology limited energy density, meaning more weight for less range compared to modern standards. Although the cars performed well for their intended purpose, scaling production while maintaining competitive pricing proved difficult. Henry Ford's influence amplified the pressure. His assembly line innovations weren't just about efficiency, they reshaped consumer expectations. Cars were no longer luxury goods, they were becoming accessible to the working class. The Model T's affordability expanded the total market dramatically. Electric car manufacturers, operating at smaller volumes, struggled to match those price reductions. There's also evidence that consumer education played a role. Gasoline engines, despite their early quirks, were supported by a growing network of mechanics and parts suppliers. As more people purchased gasoline cars, repair knowledge spread. Electric vehicles required different expertise. Battery maintenance, charging discipline, and electrical troubleshooting weren't yet common skills among drivers or local repair shops. Then came a subtle but decisive innovation. The electric starter for gasoline engines, introduced around 1912. Before that, hand-cranking a gasoline car could be dangerous. Broken wrists and arm injuries weren't uncommon. The electric starter removed that risk, eliminating one of the strongest selling points, of electric cars. Suddenly, gasoline vehicles became far more user-friendly. With each incremental improvement in gasoline technology, Detroit Electric's comparative advantages narrowed. The company didn't collapse overnight. It continued producing vehicles into the early 1920s and, in limited numbers, even beyond. Some reports indicate that small batches were assembled into the 1930s using remaining parts, but production never approached the scale of gasoline competitors. As the Great Depression approached, luxury and specialty vehicles became even harder to justify. What's striking is that Detroit Electric didn't fail because the core idea was flawed. The cars worked. They served a segment of the market effectively. Owners often praised their smoothness and reliability. The problem was alignment. The broader economic system, infrastructure network, and cultural momentum were converging around liquid fuel. In hindsight, it's tempting to frame this as a missed environmental opportunity. A green revolution paused for nearly a century. But in the 1910s, environmental concerns were not central to automotive marketing. Convenience, cost, and range dominated decision-making. Gasoline met those demands more aggressively as production scaled. By the mid-20th century, electric passenger cars had nearly vanished from mainstream roads. They survived in niche roles, industrial carts, delivery vehicles, specialized equipment, but not as symbols of personal freedom. And that's where the deeper tension emerges. If electric cars were not technologically impossible, and if they had early advantages in usability, then their disappearance tells us less about engineering limits and more about how markets reward certain trade-offs over others. To understand why the early electric era faded so thoroughly, and why it would take nearly 100 years for the concept to return to mass attention, we have to examine the energy systems and economic incentives that quietly locked gasoline into dominance. By the 1920s, the outcome was no longer uncertain. Gasoline had become the default language of mobility in the United States. Oil production surged in Texas, Oklahoma, and California. Refineries scaled up. Fuel prices stayed relatively low. Roads improved. The automobile industry consolidated around internal combustion as the standard. Detroit Electric wasn't competing against a single company. It was competing against an energy ecosystem. Gasoline cars benefited from a reinforcing cycle. More drivers meant more demand for fuel. More fuel stations made long-distance travel practical. Long-distance travel increased the appeal of powerful engines with extended range. That appeal drove further investment into engine design and oil infrastructure. The system fed itself. Electric vehicles, by contrast, operated inside a more fragile loop. Charging infrastructure depended largely on home electricity. Public charging networks didn't exist in a meaningful way. Battery technology improved slowly, constrained by the chemistry of the era. Without a breakthrough in energy density, electric cars remained heavier for the distance they could travel. And without scale, battery costs stayed high. Energy crises did not yet shape consumer thinking the way they would in the 1970s. Oil was abundant. The environmental impact of fossil fuels wasn't widely discussed. The dominant narrative framed gasoline as progress, fast, powerful, liberating. Electric vehicles came to be seen as limited, even old-fashioned. Detroit Electric's image suffered from that shift in perception. What had once looked modern began to look conservative. The enclosed carriage body styles, practical and dignified, started to feel dated as automotive design moved towards sleeker, gasoline-powered forms. Style and speed became intertwined in marketing. Electric cars with modest top speeds were rarely associated with excitement. There's also the matter of timing. Had a major oil shortage struck in the 1910s, history might have leaned differently. Had battery chemistry advanced more rapidly, range anxiety might have been less pronounced. But markets rarely pivot on hypothetical scenarios. They respond to immediate pressures. And in the early 20th century, gasoline delivered scale, flexibility, and expanding infrastructure. Detroit Electric gradually reduced production. By the late 1920s, output had dwindled. The company's presence became marginal. Some vehicles continued to operate for years. Electric motors are mechanically simple and durable. But new buyers were scarce. Eventually, production stopped altogether. The disappearance was so complete that for decades, electric passenger cars seemed like an abandoned experiment. When environmental concerns resurfaced in the late 20th century, many assumed electric vehicles were an entirely new concept. In reality, they were a rediscovery. What makes Detroit Electric's story compelling isn't just that it came early, it's that it held a legitimate foothold in the market before losing it. The company wasn't trying to introduce an untested technology into a hostile world. It was competing in a moment when multiple propulsion systems coexisted. The market made a choice, not through a single decision, but through millions of individual purchases influenced by cost, convenience, and expanding fuel networks. That choice solidified habits. Habits shaped infrastructure. Infrastructure reinforced the dominance of gasoline. And once the system matured, reversing it became far more difficult. By the time modern electric vehicles emerged in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, they weren't entering a neutral space. They were challenging a century-old structure built around oil extraction, refining, distribution, and mechanical expertise. Detroit Electric's early promise reveals something important about technological revolutions. Being first isn't enough. Even being practical isn't enough. A technology must align with energy supply, manufacturing scale, cultural aspirations, and economic incentives at the same time. In the 1910s, electric cars aligned with urban comfort and mechanical simplicity. Gasoline cars aligned with expansion, affordability, and long-distance ambition. The country leaned toward expansion, and yet, when you watch archival footage of a Detroit Electric gliding quietly through a city street, there's a strange familiarity. The absence of engine noise, the smooth acceleration, the understated design. It feels closer to modern electric vehicles than to the roaring gasoline machines that followed, which makes the final question harder to ignore. Was the early electric era truly defeated, or merely postponed until the world's priorities shifted again? If you stand in front of a preserved Detroit Electric today, the first thing you notice is how calm it looks. No exposed engine block, no chrome exhaust, just a tall, enclosed body with thin tires and a modest badge on the front. It doesn't radiate speed, it radiates composure. That composure once represented the future. In the 1910s, Detroit electric cars moved through city streets without smoke or vibration. They fit naturally into an urban rhythm shaped by streetcars and short commutes. They offered reliability at a time when gasoline engines still sputtered and stalled. For a narrow but real window, electric propulsion wasn't a fringe experiment. It was a respected choice. What changed wasn't the core function of the car. What changed was the surrounding world. Oil discoveries expanded supply dramatically, pushing fuel prices down. Mass production techniques reduced the cost of gasoline vehicles to levels electric manufacturers couldn't match. Road networks stretched farther into rural America, rewarding vehicles that could travel long distances without waiting to recharge. The invention of the electric starter erased gasoline's most visible inconvenience. Each shift nudged consumer behavior in the same direction. Detroit Electric couldn't respond at the same speed. Battery technology was constrained by chemistry. Lead-acid cells were heavy and offered limited range. Research into alternatives existed, but breakthroughs were slow and expensive. Without dramatic improvement in energy storage, electric vehicles remained optimized for predictable urban routes. Then came the Great Depression. Economic contraction reduced demand for specialty vehicles. Companies operating at smaller scale were particularly vulnerable. Detroit Electric, already diminished, quietly ceased meaningful production. There was no single headline announcing the end of the electric passenger car era. It simply receded from view. For decades afterward, the internal combustion engine defined modern life. Gas stations became landmarks. Highways reshaped cities. The sound of engines blended into the background of daily existence. Electric cars survived in forklifts and industrial equipment, but not in driveways. And yet, nothing about the Detroit Electric suggests impossibility. It wasn't a technical dead end. It was a casualty of alignment. Technology doesn't advance in isolation. It advances within economic systems, energy markets, political decisions, and cultural desires. In the 1910s, America prioritized scale, speed, and geographic expansion. Gasoline served those priorities efficiently. Electric vehicles served different priorities: cleanliness, simplicity, urban reliability. The larger system rewarded the former. When modern electric cars re-emerged nearly a century later, they did so in a different context. Oil crises had exposed vulnerability in fuel dependence. Environmental concerns had entered mainstream discourse. Battery research, driven by electronics and computing industries, had achieved energy densities unimaginable in 1910. Charging infrastructure, while still developing, benefited from an already electrified nation. The electric car didn't suddenly become viable. It became aligned. Detroit Electric's story isn't just about being a century ahead of Tesla. It's about timing, incentives, and the invisible scaffolding that determines which technologies flourish. The company proved that battery-powered transportation could work for everyday use under the right conditions. Those conditions simply didn't scale across a rapidly expanding, fuel-rich country. In that early Detroit factory, when a quiet motor propelled a carriage-shaped car across the floor, it looked like a clean break from smoke and noise. In some ways, it was. But revolutions require more than working prototypes. They require ecosystems ready to sustain them. The Detroit Electric didn't fail because it was unrealistic. It faded because gasoline, backed by abundant oil and industrial momentum, offered a broader fit for the ambitions of its time. Today, as electric vehicles once again glide silently through city streets, the arc feels less like a sudden innovation and more like a return. A reminder that the path not taken isn't always closed forever. Sometimes it's simply waiting for the world to circle back.